Good evening, everyone. I'm Peter March, Executive Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences here in Rutgers University, New Brunswick. And I'd like to welcome you to this evening's event entitled Livingston, a governor, a college, and the long echoes of slavery at Rutgers. Tonight's event is hosted by Rutgers University Alumni Association, the Livingston Alumni Association, and the Rutgers Alumni Association. These groups are all important to me for different reasons. Livingston College is one of the four legacy schools that were united to form this current School of Arts and Sciences. And the Rutgers Alumni Association is the alumni association for the School of Arts and Sciences under the RUAA umbrella. I'd like to thank Robert Snyder and Marty Siderer for bringing to light the idea for this event. I think we should all take a moment to reflect on the university's history and in social justice, in particular as documented by the 3 volumes of the Scarlet and Black Project. I would recommend to everyone to take some time to read those books if you haven't done so already. They are very revealing. I would also like to take a moment to talk about the Scarlet and Black Governor Livingston marker, which will be placed on the Livingston campus just off the pavement in the courtyard that connects the student center, the library, and the dining hall. The marker will have this inscription: Livingston campus, site of former Livingston College, was named after William Livingston, the first governor of the state of New Jersey, whose family made a fortune trafficking human beings in the transatlantic slave trade. The campus opened in 1969 as an experimental social justice-oriented campus at the site of Camp Kilmer, a World War II era military camp. The Livingston family collectively enslaved hundreds of people, and William's brothers, Philip and Robert, 2 of Rutgers' founding trustees, bought and sold hundreds more. When William Livingston moved to New Jersey, he enslaved at least 2 people, a woman named Belle and her son Lambert. Though he later advocated for gradual abolition, he continued to represent the legal interests of his slave trading family's wealth throughout his career. This marker honors Belle, Lambert, and the other women, men, and children enslaved and sold by the Livingston family. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Robert Snyder, a Livingston College alumnus, class of 1977, and Professor Emeritus of Journalism and American Studies at Rutgers University, Newark. Professor Snyder.
Thank you. Before we start, 2 housekeeping notes. All the attendees have been placed on mute for the duration of the panel. If you have questions for the Q&A portion of our evening, and I hope you do, send them using the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen throughout the event. After our speakers, we'll get to as many questions as possible. In my decades of work as a journalist and as a historian and as a professor at Rutgers Newark, I've endlessly drawn on things that I learned at Livingston College. I took great pride in the school's roots. Livingston was first envisioned as a school that would be academically elite, the MIT of the social sciences. But its mission was revised after the uprisings in Newark and other cities. Livingston instead became a college that would be deliberately multiracial, coeducational, strong in its faculty, flexible in its admissions policies, progressive in its teaching strategies, and committed to solving the problems of an urban society. Imagine my shock then when I learned that William Livingston, the New Jersey governor that my college was named after, owned human beings and represented his family's large interest in slavery. As I processed the news, I thought it important to recognize that not only William Livingston and Rutgers' connections to slavery, but also to recognize that decades of teaching, learning, and alumni achievement defined Livingston far more than the man we were named after. Out of conversations around these questions grew our panel. Our speakers tonight have strong connections to Rutgers and Livingston. Their comments will draw on both scholarly research and individual memories. Two of our speakers are contributors to Scarlet and Black, a 3-volume collection of essays on enslaved and disenfranchised peoples in Rutgers history that I recommend to anyone who wants to better understand our university's past and present. Jesse Bayker holds a PhD in history from Rutgers. At the university's Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice, he manages the Scarlet and Black Digital Archive, which uses historical primary sources to illuminate the legacy of slavery and dispossession at Rutgers. In the Scarlet and Black series, he's co-authored essays on the experiences of enslaved individuals at Rutgers and the Black student protest movement at Rutgers Camden. Brooke Thomas is a doctoral candidate in history at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. Her dissertation focuses on the political organizing and engagement of Black women's organizations. She's co-author of the essay, We the People, Student Activism at Rutgers and Livingston College, 1960 to 1985, in volume 3 of the Scarlet and Black series. Deborah O'Neill brings to our panel her own memories of studying at Livingston College in the 1980s. She graduated from Livingston in 1987 with a degree in social work and earned a master's in social work at Columbia University. She's now a training and education administrator for the state of Delaware. We'll begin with some history and work our way toward the present. Jesse, we've heard a little about William Livingston. Who was he and what was his involvement in slavery?
Well, William Livingston is the man, of course, after whom the Livingston College was named, although he didn't really have anything to do with setting up the university and what we know now as Rutgers College and then Rutgers University. But he was the first governor of New Jersey, and he really came from a New York family. He was born in New York, and he was raised in the slaveholding family where he was one of multiple brothers that were engaged in the slaveholding business that the family had. And he really came to New Jersey to sort of retire from public life. He was a lawyer in New York, and he represented his family's business interests there. But when he came to New Jersey, he thought that he was in his late 40s. He thought he wanted to live a more private life here. But of course, then the American Revolution knocked on the door, and that didn't really work out for him. So he was elected as the first governor of New Jersey. And although he was a slaveholder throughout his life, and when he came to New Jersey, he brought a couple of enslaved people to his house to serve him, a woman named Belle and her son Lambert. Throughout the Revolutionary era, he started to change his mind about slavery, and he ended up manumitting those people and really advocating for New Jersey to abolish the slave trade 20 years before the international slave trade was abolished at the national level. And also he tried to advocate for a gradual abolition in New Jersey, but he didn't succeed in that. He didn't see that enacted during his lifetime because there were just too many other slaveholding interests represented in the state legislature at the time. So, but he himself came to abolition.
What about his family's interests in slavery? They were quite large. What did the Scarlet and Black Project uncover about them, and what was their impact on Rutgers in its early days?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, William Livingston, he wasn't really involved with what was then beginning in 1766 as Queen's College, which would later become Rutgers. But actually his brothers were the trustees of Queen's College. They were the charter trustees, and they were, particularly I'm thinking of his brother, Philip Livingston. So for example, this is a man who was, he was in business in New York City. So he was running his business from New York, and he invested heavily in slave trade and voyages going to Africa and going to the Caribbean. Throughout his life, he invested in at least 15 slave trading voyages, which each one of them would be taking hundreds of enslaved Africans to the New World. But he also owned a plantation in Jamaica. So he was in New York, but he had his hand in these businesses across the Atlantic world that he was benefiting from. And really when we talk about the Livingston family in the colonial era, it's like if you said to somebody in the 20th century, the Rockefeller family. And you immediately know what that means. That means tremendous wealth and political power. And that's what the Livingstons were in New York at the time. They were, they were extremely wealthy, and they owned over 1 million acres of land in upstate New York, which was part of the source of their wealth, and hundreds of slaves in New York State, but also, this involvement in hundreds more of people who were traded across the world.
How should we think about somebody like William Livingston today?
Well, I think that William's an interesting character in his family because he was at odds with on a lot of different issues with other members of his family. And here we have a slide of him, so we can take a look what he looked like. But he was not. I don't want to portray him as a hero. Like, he's not Harriet Tubman. Right? He didn't decide to lay down his life or risk his life to free people. But I think that his story is important because it shows us that even somebody who comes from this very privileged upbringing with access to so much wealth, so much privilege, and who is so invested in this oppressive system can, throughout their life, through education, through exposure to other people's ideas, change their mind and grow. Because the reason that he came to abolition was through intellectual conversations with other people in New Jersey, particularly with a man named Samuel Allison, who was a Quaker abolitionist activist. And even though they started at very different points, William Livingston was able to open his mind up enough to take in other intellectual ideas and to recognize over time that slavery was a moral wrong, and he could not stand for it.
How would you measure the impact of the Livingston family beyond William and their money on Rutgers in its early days?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, his brother Philip and another brother of his, Robert, were both trustees. So they were, the earliest founders of Queens College. But then, their relationship with the Livingston family's relationship with school doesn't end there. One of the early presidents of Rutgers was John Henry Livingston, who was also, from this wealthy family. He's the next generation. He's actually the son-in-law and distant cousin of Philip Livingston. So he comes into some of his money through that family. And, when we're talking about generational wealth, when John Henry Livingston comes to Rutgers to be the president, well, the school is in the early 19th century really struggling financially. So they are not able to pay him very much money to be the president of the college. But how is he able to take on that job and to, he was a minister, he wanted to come and teach theology classes here. And, he was able to take that on because he had other financial resources that are handed down through these generations of wealth that is generated in large part through the slave trade.
Paul Clemens has made the point in his own research that there's not a lot of clarity on how the name William Livingston was chosen for Livingston College. In some ways, it does not seem to have received an enormous amount of thought. And in retrospect, it's an awkward match for the college that Livingston would become in some ways.
Yeah, I think that when we look at, we've tried to uncover some of the other buildings and sites and their history. How did they get their names? Now we are going around campus and putting up these historical markers that explain, hey, this person, not only Livingston, but some of the others, Frelinghuysen, Hardenberg, the Nielsen family. How did they get on here? I don't think there was a lot of thought put into their history with certainly with slavery and their involvement in that when those names were put on, but that's part of what Scarlet and Black has really tried to correct with our work, is say, let's really dig in and see this other aspect of these people's influence on New Jersey.
Thank you. Let's move forward a little bit in time now to the time when Livingston is actually an up and functioning campus and talk to Brooke Thomas. Brooke, For Black students at Livingston and at Rutgers overall, what was special about Livingston College?
I think the thing that's most special about Livingston College for so many Black and Brown students when it's open is the experimental nature of it. I think for a lot of students in the research that my co-author, Carrie Ariel, and I found was that a lot of students seem to be able to create or have the hope to create a university or college in their own image. And so we see that through an emphasis through the Puerto Rican Studies Department, which is down to the Department of Latino and Caribbean Studies, African American Studies, but also through social spaces like the fraternities and sororities, through a wide range of other clubs and organizations like UEP, BUST, so many that really work to emphasize conscious raising, cultural spaces, and I'm going to mispronounce the name, so I apologize, the Wasuli, Kuma dancers, I think Livingston allowed so many students to create a space where they could embrace their heritage, talk about their political ideologies, and also just kind of gather socially. In some works on Livingston, in terms of Rutgers history, there's a discussion about how for Black students in particular, there was this feeling of kind of isolation on some of the other campuses. But Livingston actually was the only school of all of the kind of tri-college area, was the only one that was founded where Black students didn't have to integrate. And so in a way, they were able to kind of go and create spaces for themselves in this new experimental space that had a lot of also, it's important to note as well, a lot of tremendous faculty, like Sonia Sanchez, the Black arts movement poet, she was there, as well as just a plethora of other people who I think worked with students, both Black and Latinx students in particular, to kind of create these spaces for it or support students as they work to create the spaces that they wanted to see.
You know, one of the things that I was struck by your essay is that you talked about the wide range of activities that Black students engaged in, from political activism to cultural organizations to forming fraternities and sororities. How did all of these fit together in their lives? It looks like a really complex mix. Was it always simple, or was it sometimes complicated?
It feels like it was very complicated, very complex. There's a lot of students, because I think that's mostly because of the diversity of the Livingston student body, and especially in those early years. Some of the things that we uncovered were a range of debates about kind of, because also, as you mentioned in your opening, the world in which Livingston is born, right? So thinking about like after 3 years, I think after the Newark Rebellion, a couple of months after the Newark and Camden takeovers. So there's a lot of kind of thoughts about, particularly in, for Black students, for example, about kind of like what Black students should be doing, what demands they should be making on the administration, in terms of what they want to see at the school, but also the larger community and the world. And so you get a lot, what we found was kind of a lot of different ideas about what that looks like. So for, some people, the fraternities and sororities kind of became the space in which they were able to do kind of community service programs or social things. But for those who joined, like BUST, for example, they were more engaged with like, making demands on the university, on the administration, in particular about the use of the gymnasium and debates around like the image of the college and what that would look like. So yeah, and they clash as well. They're just a bunch of different ideas about what this place should look like and what it should be. So yeah, it's not always peaceful, or at least from our research, it doesn't seem like it was always kind of completely cohesive, but it seems like that Livingston students also worked with each other, even in their kind of disagreements about, what people should be doing. They seem like they always, there was an effort to create space to hear each other out, whether it's, editorials in the Black Voice newspaper going back and forth, or even kind of a disagreement on demands of the administration. It seemed like, for all of the different ideas, there was a lot of effort to kind of work together though, and kind of find common ground, or recognize that folks had different ideas. The subheading for our, one of the sections in our chapter is like "Peace Go Be With You, Black Student," and they take that from a Gil Scott-Heron song where he goes through and names, like, whether you are Black nationalist, accommodationist, anxious freshman, whoever you might be in this kind of milieu of students, right? There's a space for you here, and we can figure something out, for kind of lack of a better phrase.
Could you remember some of the demands that students made? Can you recall some of them to give us a sense of what was on their minds?
Yeah, the one in particular that we talk about, I talk about in the chapter, is particularly over this question of the of Dean Messany himself and his qualifications to be the way in which he may have fit or not fit in terms of what Livingston stood for. So, for example, I think his background was more of an Ivy League. He had worked in the private sector and kind of industry. And so bus students in particular question, kind of what was how could he kind of function in this place that was supposed to be geared toward, supposed to be a college without ivory towers? I think we also get into, in that same kind of conversation, there are questions about the image of Livingston and this, what felt like, I think, from the dean in that moment, a push to kind of revamp the image into something a little bit more of a kind of traditional, I think what students felt like it moved away from the initial kind of vision of Livingston, which was a school with no ivory towers, a school for, racial minorities, folks from, non kind of Ivy League backgrounds in a way. And so I think I know we talk about that a little bit in the chapter, but even some of those demands to kind of hold on to Livingston's initial identity as, this experimental college that really was built around this idea of, a particular type of student.
What's some of the long-term impact of those programs that Livingston students fought for and faculty members who taught at Livingston in those early years on Rutgers?
I think one of the most salient ones is the establishment still, or the operation still of the Department of Latino and Caribbean Studies, for example, which is, I think, in its 37th year, getting close to 40, right? So some of those departments, right, these intellectual spaces that were first founded at Livingston have continued to thrive with the continued work of students and faculty. And I think my thought would be even the kind of the continued legacy around Livingston College is even maybe us doing Scarlet and Black now, right? This continued effort to see, to think about the experiences of Black students and other racial and other students of color, like at Rutgers, right? What did that look like? What were those experiences like? I think that is a couple examples, but I also like to think that it lives, the legacy of Livingston lives through its own, through its alumni who have these memories of what Livingston was like, what it offered. We used a couple of oral histories, for example, in our chapter, and people remembering what Livingston kind of offered for them, the spaces that it created, and the way that it came to work. For example, Patricia Graham, who's mentioned, she talks about how she took what she learned in the classroom at Livingston in her own classroom when she went on to teach on the college level after graduation.
Yeah, thank you. Let's hear a bit more now from somebody who was a Livingston student, Deborah O'Neill. Deborah, can you tell us about when you came to Livingston College and where you came from?
Sorry about that. I'm a first-generation college student. So coming to Rutgers was exciting. I wanted to be a bit far away from home, but not too far. You can imagine that as a student. And I found that I was drawn to Livingston for a few reasons. Rutgers, it's a rigorous process to get in, as everyone knows, but there was some flexibility in some of the criteria in order for me to qualify to be a student at the university. And I also wanted to be on a co-ed campus. So those were a couple of the things that I was drawn to. And looking for a place where I could start to grow and develop my academic pursuits, which initially was in the science areas when I came to campus.
Now, what did you move on to when you started with science? Where did you go next and why?
Well, I started out in the sciences, and unfortunately, math wasn't my friend. And so I ended up making some decisions about my major and changed to social work. And I think was a really great fit for me. The undergraduate social work program at the time was housed at Livingston College. It was not part of the School of Social Work at the time. And some really dynamic instructors and faculty helped really shape my ideas and really bring forward what was important to me, really working with people and understanding the world around me. So I was really excited about the program and stuck with that as a major.
When you were at Livingston, you were at a college where political debates ran strong, where protest was part of everyday life on the campus. How did that shape your education?
That was a new arena for me. I lived in a small town in Garfield, and Bergen County was a small place. I went to high school and elementary school with the same groups of kids. So coming to campus, I was involved with now a different array of people with a lot of different ideas and interests. So the conversations were very dynamic and thought-provoking in ways that I hadn't thought about, initially coming to college. And for me, at that time, probably opened my eyes to some things that I just wasn't as clearly aware of in the same way now that I'm on campus. When you're starting to have conversations with students about, debating about, about what's going on in the world. Apartheid was one of the big issues at the time when I was on campus, and talking about the divestiture of the university funds. Those were hot debates and conversations, and to really think about what that meant for the folks in South Africa, but then parallel that to what does that mean for some of those same kinds of racial disparities that were happening here at home.
This is really great. In your work as a social worker, have you drawn on things that you learned at Livingston? Can you think of examples of that?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, the ability to work with diverse groups of people. I think I was involved with the Liberated Choir when I was on campus, involved in activities that were sponsored by some of the fraternities and sororities that people talked about in the clubs, and some of the protest activities. I mean, I wasn't necessarily one of the leads, but I was part of the student groups that were supporting those activities that were on campus. And it really opens your eyes to being able to listen and hear different perspectives and understand there's more than one point of view. And sometimes we may not always agree with those different points of view, but they are valid for the person that's sharing them. So how do we learn to understand them? And in what ways can we either work together, or how do we need to work in concert? And sometimes we may not always agree, but it's important to be able to understand those differences.
Jesse, you just posted in the chat something that I'd like to share more widely. What remains in the archives of some of these protest movements that we just heard about?
Well, we actually have a chapter in our third volume of Scarlet and Black about that anti-apartheid activism that was written by Tracy Johnson, one of our alumni in the PhD program in history. And some of the materials that are in this digital collection are photographs of students protesting. And you can see that these are multiracial groups of students that are pushing for this. It's really a broad coalition. And there are flyers about the different events that they were doing, and also reports that the students were writing up to really make the case to the administration and really bring the evidence and really bring strong arguments for why Rutgers should divest. So they did a lot of research actually there, and some of that is reflected in the archival materials.
That's great. Deborah, is there more that you want to share on your memories of your time at Livingston that would help us understand the impact of the school today?
I think one of the things as a Livingston alum, and when I talk to my alumni colleagues, one of the things that we all share is what was developed as this, it's always referred to as a social experiment. I don't know if I came to school thinking I was coming into a science experiment of sorts, But a lot of the courses you mentioned about Africana studies, Latino studies, and the like that have been developed and evolved with the university have now become part of Rutgers as a larger system. And Livingston alumni, we feel that all these things started with us, started on Livingston campus and now has grown to be part of the larger Livingston legacy. So, what Rutgers is now is what Livingston was and was developing all along. So it's really exciting to see that the work that was done by many students and faculty continues to thrive and grow within the university system.
I want to start to go to some of the questions that are streaming into the chat box, and post your questions in the Q&A section, and then you can move on, and they're getting forwarded to me and I can post them. One question that comes through was, how supportive was the faculty for Livingston students engaged in activism? In what ways did they support students? I can't resist telling an anecdote. When I arrived on the campus in September of 1973, there was a rumor going around among the freshmen that one professor had convened a class. There were about 35 students in the class, and he walks into the room and says, "All right, who here is willing to get arrested?" And like 10 students raise their hands. And then he shouts, "The rest of you, out of you, out of here. I don't want you in my class." Now that was folklore, and I'm not even sure that that was true, but there was a sense that the faculty encouraged students to be politically involved, and they also encouraged them to think for themselves. Any of the panelists want to talk about that?
Yeah, I will kind of echo that. I will speak kind of to one of the things that we uncovered in our Scarlet and Black research was it seems very much like, and maybe this won't speak directly to activism per se, but in terms of like Robert mentioned, of thinking, having students kind of think for themselves and imagine the world around them. One of the women that Patricia Graham, whose oral history used, she mentioned the one thing about Livingston was that she felt comfortable with her faculty. Like she felt like she could have a conversation with them, and she wasn't afraid, kind of intimidated by her faculty. And I think that kind of speaks to the nature of, it seems like the relationship between some maybe not all, but a lot of some faculty and students, or the efforts of faculty to kind of create safe or kind of non-hierarchical or less hierarchical spaces for the students and the faculty. She also talks about faculty who would have events in New York. And so in addition to kind of the lesson being in someone's apartment and kind of, having dinner and other things, of being able to kind of explore, the city. And there were other students who went on international trips. And I guess I say all that to say, I think it feels like, in lieu of maybe an exact example of how Livingston faculty were supportive to students, it does seem like there was kind of there was an effort by at least some faculty to kind of create a safer space, or kind of a comfortable space for students to lean on faculty for probably a range of kind of intellectual needs, but also potentially activist efforts as well.
Yeah, Deborah, do you want to speak to that too, from your own education?
Yeah, I would say for me, I could speak to supportive faculty. I think that the faculty were supportive in trying to help make sure that, at least from my experience, trying to make sure that me as a student would succeed at this university and get what I need, by way of helping me with understanding my courses, being available, making that time. I know that we've had faculty support with some of the clubs and groups that I was involved in, so that we can thrive. I know for the choir, we would go out into the community, local churches, and then around New Brunswick. So to do those activities, we needed the supports from the school and from the university to do those kind of activities. We had strong fraternity and sorority presence on campus back in the 80s. So I'm not a Greek, so I can't speak to that directly, but they were present, which means that there had to be support for those organizations to thrive. And I do know that there was a strong the Latino Studies department, and from students that I knew at the time, seemed to get a lot of support from that faculty as well. So I would agree.
One thing that comes up in Brooke's essay, and it's coming up in the chat too, was Livingston clearly was hugely important for Black students. It was hugely important for Puerto Rican students, but it was also a multiracial campus. And how did people get along in that environment? Where were people apart from each other? Where were people in touch with each other? Where were they in cooperation? Where were they in conflict? Anybody want to speak to that?
Well, Rob, as I mentioned, actually, the anti-apartheid movement was definitely one where students came together from across different backgrounds. So we see that, that's one of the spaces, but also some of the kind of anti-war activists. If we'll look, we didn't turn up so much of documentation about it, but looking through some of the yearbooks, it's clear looking at the pictures that you have different people that are, advocating alongside each other against the war. So that's another space.
Yeah, Deborah, do you want to add to that? Anything that you, or Brooke?
I think in regard to the apartheid movement is the best example I could give. There was a lot of, there was a intersection of different racial groups, all looking for the university to do its part in regard to the apartheid movement. But I think with all groups, I think there's always those tensions because we're all vying for trying to make our statement in regard to where we are in the world. So at times where things can work together, there were times when there might have been some areas where there were some disagreements or we weren't always working in collaboration on all issues. I know even as an African-American student coming to campus, there were times where I had to dealing with my students of my own generation about my being there, because some felt I came from a county that was more wealthy, therefore I felt I was more privileged, and that wasn't the case. So I think we had to, kind of reconcile some of those same issues that were going on in society around us, also on the campus. It doesn't matter where my address is, but what was my purpose for being here, and what are my belief systems, and when I got there, and as I developed as a person as part of being on campus.
Brooke, please go ahead. Yes.
Oh, no, I was just going to add that, one of the things, I know my co-author focused more on this, but there's a moment of tension in like 1973 between Black students and Puerto Rican students. I may have mentioned to you over the firing of a dean as a part of the Black students' demands, but the Puerto Rican students were very much against that and supported. But what she talks about is the way, in the list of the 43 demands that the students give, they are able to kind of come together and kind of, for a lack of, kind of come together in a sense about, the outcome of that, right? Like how can we kind of come together and figure out what's most important to us? It seems like the bigger, they were able to kind of acquiesce on some and kind of come together for others, and really the bigger questions issues seem to be kind of the state of the college itself and the world, and kind of just the words are escaping me, living conditions, the health center, things like that. So I think to echo Deb's point, I think there were issues where people, there are convergences on bigger issues as students came together to think about things, but also moments, of tension where folks were, had different ideas about what was most important or less important and so on.
Your essay reminded me of the residential arrangements in the dorms, where quad 3 of the 3 quads was a majority Black quad. Quad 1 was more white, quad 2 was more mixed. And sometimes it was hard to create meeting spaces outside those quads for people. And on this, I'd give a huge shout out to the jazz program, which created, I thought, genuinely generous, exciting programming that brought people of all ethnic and racial backgrounds together for what was, I think, one of the greatest things about the Livingston campus, which was its jazz scene. which was the envy of all of Rutgers, I thought, when I was there. And I thought it created really great opportunities for exchange and communication that sometimes didn't happen so easily, elsewhere on the campus. And so I think Larry Ridley and his colleagues just did heroic work that day that was hugely helpful. Let's look for another question. Is there anything of Livingston's special energy and diversity left on the Livingston campus today? Maybe Deborah, you can address that.
I'm trying to think about that. The campus has changed. It's evolving, I guess, just like the rest of the world. We have a whole set of new buildings, the business school, new residence halls, multi-use buildings, even a movie theater. Who would have thought back in 1980 that there would have been a movie theater on Livingston campus? So I think there is energy around being on Livingston campus. I don't know if I would say I don't know if it still has the same undertone of this social justice environment, not living and being on campus every day, to say that. But I think there's more interest to being at Livingston than maybe in some years between the time I was there in the 80s and now. And I think that brings more student body to the campus, and therefore there's an integration and a mix of thoughts and ideas that are brought to the campus. But that's the best I can say, having been removed from campus life for a period of time.
I have two thoughts about that. One is, and I think this is one of the truest things that was ever said about Livingston College, certainly in the 1970s when I was there, was that it was the college where Black, white, and Puerto Rican students all felt discriminated against. We were well aware that our facilities were brand new, that they often lacked what you would expect from a fully developed college, and it could make life there tough sometimes. And it could make you resilient in the long run, but it could be kind of oppressive on a day-to-day basis. And that has dramatically changed. I mean, the Livingston campus is now the bougie campus in comparison to the rest of the university. And who would have thought that it would one day become the home of the business school? I mean, it's a little bit ironic for an old timer like me to contemplate this, but I think that is, part of the long-term trend is now a well-developed campus, very different from what we found there in the 1970s when we first got there. But what also strikes me, and I say this having been in a few Livingston forums, is that Livingston spirit that I think we all recognized persisted. It persisted even though the university went through a period of centralization that really zeroed out Livingston as an independent college. Down into the 90s, people talked about Livingston as the more activist place in Rutgers, the more multiracial place, the more creative place. And I was once at an event where people were speaking who went to Livingston as far back as the 70s and as recently as the 90s. They all described the same college. They were very different people. One was a career officer in the Marine Corps. Another was a police officer who became a criminologist. Another one was a woman who was an artist and a musician. All of them described the same school, where you had to think on your feet, you had to learn to get along with different people, you were often caught up in all sorts of political debates, and you had to learn to hold your ground, but also listen to other people. And I'm fascinated by how that spirit lasted much longer than I ever expected it to. And I think that was a very good thing.
I would have to agree. That's an exciting element of Livingston, which continues to live on. And I know all of us that are alumni of Livingston College are, proud to have that kind of legacy from the place that we called home for the years we were on campus. Something small that may not seem like much to most, Livingston was very barren, is a good way to describe it. There was not a lot out there besides our buildings. And I was on campus recently, actually not too far from where the placard is. One of the things that I noticed that was striking to me is when you were in the lounge in Livingston, you could see out to what was a courtyard area because it was quite open. Now it's very green. There's lots of trees and bushes, but you can't quite see in. And that may sound trivial, but to be able to see your other classmates walking around campus, people you may want to, say hi to or catch up with, being obscured by the trees, the bushes, was just a small thing as I walked around the campus, kind of like, it's a little different in here. But I remember a lot of discussions and debates that happened in the lounge. I remember, we had our choir rehearsals in the lounge. We've had I was involved with our Christian groups in the lounge. We've had parties in the Great Hall. There were gathering places that were very sacred to students that were on campus, and the places, as you were talking about, where you can have those debates. So it's evolving, and the spaces and places that we meet and gather now are changing and evolving, which is part of life. And I think that for Livingston to continue to thrive and grow, it just speaks to our resilience and the roots that were placed many, many years ago to set us in this trajectory.
Jesse, I want to bring you back into the discussion and help us develop a sense of context here. When Livingston was growing up in the 60s and 70s, there were also movements at Camden and in Newark that changed those universities as well within Rutgers, right? Can you tell us a little bit about those schools and how they evolved and help us understand the larger changes in Rutgers that Livingston and Rutgers Newark and Rutgers Camden contributed to?
Sure. So at the moment when Livingston was emerging, there was a lot of Black student activism going on at Newark and in Camden. And, really have to understand the difference between New Brunswick and these other two campuses. And the difference was that the location and the relationship between the university and the surrounding community, where a lot of the Black students who were in New Brunswick, they were coming from different parts of the state. And they were kind of coming into this new community, and they were not necessarily connected with the New Brunswick Black community. Whereas in Newark and Camden, you had more local students who were very much concerned about the relationship between the Ivory Tower and their home community in Newark and in Camden. And these are cities that had a large Black population that saw, in Newark, you have the urban uprising in 1967, same thing in Camden in 1969 and 71. So there's a lot of tension in the community, and the students both in Newark and Camden, they make the case to the university that, first of all, the university is admitting very few Black students into those schools. But the ones that are there, they're saying, hey, now that we're here, we see this as this ivory tower that is completely disconnected from what's going on in the city. And these social problems that we need to be solving in the city, the university is not using its resources to think about those problems, to teach students how they will solve those problems, or to help the communities in any way. And we need to change that. And we also need to address the problem of admissions and admit more students who are down the street at the high school in Newark or in Camden, and they're not coming to Rutgers University. Why is that? That needs to change. So this is what the students there were pushing for, and they were really very much connected to the community activists and to the community organizations in those cities, and that's that engagement with their with the Black Power organizations within those communities in those cities, that really shaped the way that those students went about their tactics to change what was going on at the university, the demands that they made on the university, and their tactics of taking over buildings and really staging these dramatic protests. In 1969, both in Newark and in Camden, students take over buildings for multiple days and make this very public protest, asking the university to address their demands.
It's one reminder of what you just said, that I think one of the most significant things about Livingston was that it was born integrated, right? It did not have to go through the same process that frankly Rutgers College did in New Brunswick or Camden and Newark did in their own. It had a large population of Afro-American and Puerto Rican students at the birth of Livingston. I think that's a significant factor.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what makes Livingston stand out and be so different from these other spaces. And, you know, so it has its own trajectory. That's very, you know, it looks very different when you're in Camden and you have this university where you have, you know, fewer than 20 Black students enrolled in the whole college. And you know, and then the students felt like that's a problem of integration, and we need to integrate. I mean, there's a handful of us here, right? But that is not fully integrated school, and that needs to change.
One question just came in that I want to put to you. What motivated Rutgers students and faculty to investigate the university's ties to slavery? What sparked that?
Well, what sparked that, you know, this really emerged around the 250th anniversary of the school's founding that we were celebrating in 2016. And at that moment, you know, it was really a moment to reflect on our history. And there was a lot of celebration of revolutionary Rutgers, right? We were founded in 1766. And really the school grows up during the revolutionary era. So there was a lot of rah, rah, Rutgers, and a lot of talk of pride of our heritage. And it was the group of students who were primarily affiliated with the Black Lives Matter organizations on campus in New Brunswick who came to the Chancellor of New Brunswick, Richard Edwards, and said to him, well, if we're talking about our history and we're going to celebrate it, what about this other aspect of our history? And what about slavery? I mean, Rutgers, if you're talking about a colonial college that's established in 1766, you have to have a conversation about slavery and dispossession. And those students, that's what prompted really the whole project to take off. And then, you know, certainly to the Chancellor's credit, he, I think, really embraced what the students were asking for and said, we're going to go full force on this and investigate this history and commit the resources that are needed to investigate something that hasn't really gotten any attention before.
We are closing in on the end of our hour, and I want to give our panelists a minute apiece so to just talk about what this conversation has prompted for them, what thoughts have occurred to them. So Deborah, do you want to go first? Any final thoughts you want to share with us?
I think this whole idea, you know, with Scarlet and Black helps reveal some things in our history. I know here in Delaware, we're talking about infusing Black history into the curriculum. And I think we just have to be honest with the whole history. You know, we could celebrate our founding and we can celebrate all the milestones that we have. But we also have to recognize that some of what we're going to find in our history is not things that we're going to be very proud of. And I think owning that part of it is part of how we grow and develop and continue to thrive as a college and a university system. So I thank the researchers for the work they've done. I really appreciate that the university has taken this on to put this in the forefront. And we have to just continue to be honest with some of our history is not always going to be as pleasant as we hope. But I thank you all for allowing us to have this opportunity to talk about and celebrate my favorite place on campus is Livingston. So thank you for that.
Brooke, what would you like to add?
Yeah, I would just like to actually, one of the questions that we weren't able to get to in the chat from Leslie, who says something about the name of Livingston. And I know Jesse talked about it, I think a little bit at the beginning of, you know, this current effort to kind of, one of the ideas of Scarlet and Black is to kind of get at that. And one of the things that didn't make it into our chapter was that there is a debate over renaming Livingston, right? Some students do propose that the school should be renamed. And I just think that speaks to one, what from my research, speaks to me as a kind of the legacy of Livingston. It really even speaks to kind of what I think a lot of, which led to the student activism, which led to the Scarlet and Black Project itself, right? And this idea of creating space where we can get at these very messy histories, complicated histories, but also legacies of student activism and really students creating spaces for themselves in the university or college space. And so I think that's been one of the most enlightening things, one of the best things that I've kind of gotten to explore as a Scarlet and Black researcher is thinking about just the ways in which students work to shape universities and college spaces. So yeah, and also thank you for having me as well. I'll take my opportunity to say that there.
Very good. Jesse, anything you want to finish with? 1 minute.
I just want to say thank you to you, Rob, and you, Deborah, because it's it's wonderful. We go in the archive and we try to dredge up these old documents and try to figure out the history. But it's really always wonderful to hear from our alumni who were there, and saw Livingston, how it was in the 70s and 80s. So I appreciate hearing from you, your stories and your anecdotes, and something that Deborah said at the end just now just made me think of something that I've been thinking a lot of, that President Holloway said recently, and that's that mature institutions that are confident in who they are in the present can handle and withstand telling stories about their past. And I would like to think that at Rutgers, this is what we aspire to be, a mature institution that can talk about our past without feeling like it's putting us to shame, or it doesn't discredit us in the present to acknowledge our history.
Let me just close with two thoughts that occurred to me as I was working on the program. It's important to understand Livingston's diversity, and I think we've taken a big step towards that tonight. But let me close with two ideas. One is from Martin Luther King, and the other is from a Livingston graduate. Desegregation, Martin Luther King wrote, only removes legal and social prohibitions. Integration, as he saw it, meant getting beyond living elbows together and hearts apart to achieve genuine intergroup interpersonal doing. In an integrated society, King thought, different people, sometimes with clashing ideas, would nevertheless live in a constructive equality of oneness. In my Livingston days, King's vision sometimes seemed like a utopian ideal, but I caught enough glimpses of that ideal made real that made my college education a long-term source of inspiration and strength for me. As my college friend Steve Zurier observed, going to Livingston meant that when we were very young, we became part of something bigger than ourselves that accomplished a lot of good in the world. We can all be proud of that, of all that we've done with the name of Livingston. I want to thank our panelists for their excellent comments. I want to thank the attendees for their questions. I want to thank everyone who helped organize this. You'll receive an email with links on resources, and this conversation will be put up on Rutgers Alumni's YouTube channel for the future. So thank you all for turning out tonight, and good night.